afternoon. Special time on a Sunday. Learning at noon Pacific today because Nina and I are attending a wedding. It's great to be learning with you on a Sunday. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on Yom Rishon? I always say the names of the week, but maybe not everyone is familiar. It's much simpler, if you're learning the days of the week in Hebrew than in English. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. What do those have to do with the days of the week? In Hebrew, Yom Rishon, the first day. That's Sunday. Yom Sheni, that's the second day. That's Monday. It's just simply called the second day. Yom Shlishi, Yom Revi'i, Yom Hamishi. The second day, the third day, the fourth day, the fifth day, the sixth day. Friday is the sixth day. And then Shabbos. Okay, so who's in the house? Sharon in New Jersey, Joe in the Inland Empire, Bella in Florida, Paul in the Great Northwest, Melissa in Great Neck, Gordo in Scotland, delighted to be able to tune in live again. Bill in Mid-Missouri asking for prayers for his friend May, who's got a doctoral defense. May she have all her wits about her. And Mazel Tov to the happy couple. I'll pass it on. Actually, the Chassan, the groom, was in our minyan this morning, although he's not always with us because he doesn't live in our neighborhood. But he was with us this morning, and when a groom, on the day of his wedding, is in shul, we skip the Tachanun prayer, the prayer where we ask for forgiveness. You don't have that prayer on certain days, like when it's a holiday, or when there's a bris in the shul, a brit milah, a circumcision, or even if the people, the father or the sandak, people who are going to be involved in the brit milah are in the morning prayers. And likewise, if the groom, because the groom was with us today, we skipped Tachanun, and there's this relief that comes over. It's just a funny thing. It's kind of an old joke, an inside joke. That people not in our community will never understand the feeling one has when he's involved in the morning prayers, and suddenly we skip over the Tachanun prayer. It's like a 5 to 10 minute section of the prayers get skipped, and we skip them because there's some joyful event going on. So it's a nice feeling. All right, let's get to it. I wasn't intending to do a double daf today, but they're just 2 short pages, and there was no natural break that made sense, so we're going to get ahead. Nice thing, we're going to be a little bit ahead, but it should be a normal length class, maybe even a little on the short side. Let's get to it. We're picking this up on our dafs today are pages 26 and 27. We're picking it up near the top of page 26a with Mishna number 12 here in chapter 2 of Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud. The Mishnah: a person may not plant a tree near the field of another unless he distances it 4 cubits from the field. And this is the case whether he is planting grapevines or any kind of tree. If there was a fence between them, well, then this one may place, i.e. plant, his grapevines or trees close to the fence from this side, and that one may place his trees or vines close to the fence from the other side of the fence. Now, if the roots were spreading into the field of another, the owner of the field may dig to a depth of 3 handbreadths, even if he severs those roots so that they do not impede his plow. And if he was digging a cistern, a ditch, or a cave in that spot, and he came upon the roots of his neighbor's tree, well, he may continue cutting downward normally, and the wood of those roots belongs to him, even though the roots emerge from a tree that was planted on his neighbor's property. That's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. A Tana, which is to say a rabbi of the period of the Mishnah, a Tana taught the 4 cubits that the sages stated that one must leave between a vineyard and a neighbor's field. What are they for? They are for the work of the vineyard, so that the owner of the vineyard does not take his oxen and a plow into his neighbor's field while working his own vineyard. You have to leave this space along the edge of your vineyard so that you can bring your oxen, your cart, your plow to do the work of your vineyard or of your field or of your orchard with it and stay within your property. Since you're going to need to bring that cart along the edge of your vineyard, you shouldn't be planning on trespassing on your neighbor's property in order to bring that cart or that plow, that ox, to do the work of your field, and that's why you need this setback, so you won't trespass when you work your field. Shmuel says they taught this law, this halacha, only with regard to Eretz Yisrael, to the land of Israel. But in Bavel, in Babylonia, 2 cubits are sufficient. Why? Because their plows are shorter. And this opinion is also taught in a baraisa. A person may not plant a tree near the field of another unless he distances the tree 2 cubits from the field. But didn't we learn in our Mishnah 4 cubits? Rather, is it not correct that there is a difference between the law of Eretz Yisrael and the land of Bavel in this regard, as stated by Shmuel? And the Gemara concludes, indeed, learn from it that this is so. And there are those who raise this matter in the form of a contradiction. We learned in the Mishnah that a person may not plant a tree near the field of another unless he distances it 4 cubits from the field. But isn't it taught in a baraisa that 2 cubits are sufficient? And Shmuel said, La kasha, this is not difficult. Here it is referring to Bavel, and there it is referring to Eretz Yisrael. Now the Gemara relates, so there's 3 different ways to learn it, but same rule. You need a 4 cubit setback in Israel and a 2 cubit setback in Bavel. The Gemara relates that Rava bar Rav Hanan had these palm trees that stood adjacent to the boundary of Rav Yosef's vineyard. And birds would come and roost on the palm trees belonging to Rava bar Rav Hanan. And then they would subsequently descend to the vineyard and damage it, right? So the palm trees attracted the birds, and once the birds were nearby, they would descend into the vineyard belonging to Rav Yosef. So the palm trees on his neighbor's land ended up causing birds to come and then cause damage on Rav Yosef's vineyard. So Rav Yosef said to Rava bar Rav Hanan, go and cut down your palm trees. They attract these birds. The birds do me harm. You should cut the palm trees. Rava bar Rav Hanan said to him, but I distanced them the required amount. There's nothing illegal. It doesn't violate any law, any halacha that where my trees are standing. Why should I cut them down? So Rav Yosef said to him, this matter, i.e. this specific distance, applies only to trees, but a greater distance is required for vines, right? So maybe palm trees near palm trees or vines near vines, but now that you have palm trees near my vines, you're causing damage, and a greater setback is required because it's not the same kind of damage we were talking about in the Mishnah. Trees near trees because of roots, vines near vines because of working the land. But because birds are not going to be attracted to these vines and then run over to these vines, birds are not going to, if they come to your palm tree, which is near the neighbor's palm tree, they're not going to cause damage to the neighbor's palm tree. But in this particular situation of a palm tree near vines, that's where the bird damage, the bird hazard comes into play. And for this special circumstance, you need a greater distance, says Rav Yosef. Rava bar Rav Hanan, he's not so ready to cut down his palm trees, so he's going to argue back with Rav Yosef. Says Rava bar Rav Hanan, but didn't we learn in the Mishnah that this is the law, whether he is planting grapevines or any kind of tree? And Rav Yosef said to him, this matter only applies to the distance between a tree and a tree, or between a vine and vines. But with regard to the space between a tree and vines, the Mishnah did not rule, and since you're doing damage, you need more distance. So the Gemara relates that Rav Hanan, Rava bar Rav Hanan, he's not going to give up yet. So he says to Rav Yosef, listen, I see what you're saying, but I myself will not cut down my palm trees. Why? Different reason than whether I'm damaging you or not. I will not cut down my palm trees because, as Rav said, with regard to this palm tree that produces 1 kav of fruit, meaning it is a productive fruit tree, it is prohibited to cut it down. Due to the verse, Deuteronomy 20:19, you shall not destroy the trees. Right? A productive fruit tree is something that sort of God has sent into this world that is feeding God's creatures, and we have to be very wary of cutting down a productive tree. It violates this verse in the Torah. So I don't want to cut it down. And Rabbi Hanina says, my son Shichat died only because he cut down a fig tree before its time. So Rabbi Bar Rav Chanan continues saying to Rav Yosef, if the master is amenable to do so, he may cut them down, but I will not do it. You want to cut down that palm tree because it's harming you? Okay, I understand what you're saying. You cut it down. I'm not going to cut down a productive fruit tree. And quite interesting that the story leaves off there. So maybe Rav Bar Rav Chanan made a very good point and saying, do you want that curse on hanging over your head that you cut down a productive fruit tree? Be my guest. And unclear whether Rav Yosef took him up on it or not. New story. The Gemara further relates that Rav Papa had these palm trees that stood adjacent to the boundary of the property of Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua. So this is a different story altogether, but again, we have two sages who are neighbors discussing what is the halacha of interference with the neighbor's quiet enjoyment of his property. So in this situation, Rav Papa had palm trees that stood adjacent to the boundary of the property of Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua. So Rav Papa went and found Rav Huna digging and cutting his roots. And Rav Papa said to him, what is this? And Rav Huna said to him, well, we learned in the Mishna, if the roots were spreading into the field of another, the owner of the field may dig to a depth of 3 handbreadths, even if he severs those roots, so that they do not impede his plow. So, your trees that are planted on your property, their roots are growing into my property. Our Mishnah says I can cut and sever those roots so they don't impede my plow, and I can dig to a distance of 3 handbreadths for that purpose. Rav Papa said to him, well, this statement applies only up to 3 handbreadths, whereas the master is digging and cutting down more than 3. You just gave me a proof, a source for why you can dig to a distance of 3 handbreadths and cut my roots. Okay, but look at the hole you're making. It's deeper than 3 handbreadths. Rav Huna said to him, well, I am digging cisterns, ditches, and caves. For that, we know that we can go much deeper. If it's only to prevent the roots from impeding the plow, that's 3 handbreadths depth. But if it's because I'm installing a cistern, a ditch, or a cave on my property, then I can go as deep as I want and sever your roots. And not only that, our Mishnah said that the one who is digging can keep the wood of those roots for himself. Right? Rav Huna said to him, I am digging cisterns, ditches, and caves. As we learned in the Mishnah, if he was digging a cistern, a ditch, or a cave, he may cut downward normally, and the wood from the roots is his. So Rav Papa said, I told him all the proofs I could find, but I was unable to convince him that I was correct until I told him that which Rav Yehuda says. And now we're on page 26b. With regard to a strip of land over which the public has an acquired privilege of use, one may not destroy it. Well, here too, since I have an acquired privilege of use of this land, you are not permitted to destroy that which I possess. And after Rav Papa left, Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, said, why did I not say to him that there an acquired privilege of use is effective when it is within 16 cubits, as within that area the roots are considered part of the tree, whereas here I cut the roots of the palm trees beyond 16 cubits. Now, this is already curious because if they're saying, oh, I should have said to him, or I'm sorry, Rav Papa was able to prevail in the argument by saying, well, the public can acquire an easement over your property because they've been using it for a long time, and then you can't interfere with that. Okay, that's normally considered because they have a walking path. Maybe you could say if the public, sort of like a public park has a tree and its roots grew into private property, and it was doing that for a long time, then this is sort of like a publicly owned tree that would have acquired this right to continue drawing sustenance from the neighbor's property. Maybe you could argue with that. But here we're talking about two private properties, right? These are neighbors. Where's the public involved? How could this ruling about the public acquiring the right to some kind of benefit from somebody's private land, how does that apply here? Yeah, Rav Papa is a member of the public, but we're talking about his tree on his land whose roots are growing into his neighbor's land. How does that even apply? And now we're also learning that these roots are extending beyond 16 cubits. So even if it was a public acquisition, the public only acquires 16 cubits distance, radius around a tree trunk. And this was further than that. So even if you could make the argument about public acquiring land, this was beyond that, and it wouldn't have worked anyway. But the point is that Rav Huna already said, okay, fine, I'll let the tree's roots stay. And once he made that once he acceded to that request, he felt like he couldn't go back on his word. At any rate, the story ends there. Now, the Mishnah teaches that if the neighbor is digging a cistern, a ditch, or a cave, he may cut downward, and the wood is his. Now, the sage Yaakov of Hadayev raises a dilemma before Rav Chisda. To whom does the wood belong? The Mishnah says that the wood is his. Now, we just assume that because, like he's the one cutting the roots of the neighbor, that the wood belongs to him. But you could also say, well, he's cutting the roots of his neighbor, and therefore the wood is his, meaning the neighbor's, right? So you're allowed to dig down and sever those roots and remove that wood. But who does that wood actually belong to? This word, his, this pronoun, who is it referring to? Is it to the neighbor, who's cutting those roots because they're in his land, or is it the owner of the tree next door? That's what the Gemara is asking. So Rav Chisda said to him, you learn the answer in a Mishnah in Tractate Me'ilah. Me'ilah is about misuse of consecrated property on page 13b. If the roots of a tree belonging to an ordinary person extend into a field belonging to the holy temple, meaning to the temple treasury, one may not derive benefit from them. But if one derive benefit from them, he is not liable for misuse of consecrated property. That is, even if one does transgress the prohibition and benefit from them, it is not considered misuse, and he is not liable to bring an offering. It's sort of like a gray area. So you shouldn't do it, but if you did do it, it doesn't rise to the level of an offense that triggers the obligation to bring an offering. Now, granted, if you say that we follow the tree and the roots are considered part of it, it is due to that reason that one is not liable for misuse, as the tree is not consecrated, right? So the first case is the tree belongs to an ordinary person, it's on his land, the roots extend into a piece of land that is adjacent, that used to belong, let's say, to a private person, to his neighbor, but that neighbor consecrated that piece of land and gave it to the temple treasury. That's why the neighboring plot of land now belongs to the treasury. So now those roots extend right into the temple's land and is deriving benefit from the temple's land, right? It's taking moisture from land that belongs to the temple. So he is deriving benefit from the temple treasury, but he's not liable to bring an offering for that, presumably because, he didn't do anything wrong and he didn't consecrate his tree. So that sounds like the tree was not consecrated, even though its roots are drawing moisture from the consecrated land. So granted, if you say that we follow the tree and the roots are considered part of it, it is due to that reason that one is not liable for misuse, as the tree is not consecrated. But if you say we follow the land, i.e. the roots in the neighboring land belong to that land's owner, then why is this guy not liable to bring an offering for misuse of consecrated property? And the Gemara asked, rather, what will you say, that we follow the tree? Well, if so, say that the last clause of that Mishnah, that if roots of a tree belonging to the temple treasury, right now the tree is on the land that was consecrated, belongs to the temple treasury, and the roots extend into the private person's property. He's digging, a cistern, and he cuts off those roots. Now, if he keeps the wood, right? If he keeps the wood, isn't this wood that originated in a tree that is consecrated property? And if he keeps that wood for himself, that would be misuse of consecrated property? Or do we say he's allowed to keep that wood because of our Mishnah, that you can keep the wood of the roots that you cut that extend into your own land when you're digging for a cistern, in which case there would be no misuse of consecrated property? Right? So now the Gemara asks, rather, what will you say, that we follow the tree? But if so, then in the last clause of the Mishnah, that if the roots of a tree belonging to the temple treasury extend into a field of an ordinary person, one may not derive benefit from them, but if one did derive benefit from them, he is not liable for misuse of consecrated property. But if we follow the tree, why is he not liable for misuse of consecrated property? The tree is in land belonging to the temple treasury, so it must be that we follow the land. So what we're talking about is a gray area, where that's why the sages are saying, in this mixed case, right, either where the tree is on private property and its roots go into the temple treasury land, or the tree is on temple treasury land and its roots go out to ordinary property. In both cases, you shouldn't make use of anything that might belong to the temple treasury. But if you did use it, you're not going to be guilty of me'ila, of misuse of consecrated property, because it's so gray that it's not strong enough transgression, as it were, to trigger liability to bring an offering. Now the Gemara responds, are these cases comparable? In both clauses of the Mishnah, we are dealing with growths that came thereafter, i.e., after the tree was consecrated, and the Tan of that Mishnah holds that with regard to growths that grew from a consecrated plant or tree, they are not subject to the laws of misuse of consecrated property. Only the original plant is. Consequently, there is no connection between that Mishnah and the question of whether roots are considered part of the tree or part of the land. Right? In the case of Me'ila, the operative principle might be that even if you consecrate a tree, after it's consecrated, further growths are not necessarily consecrated. And so we can't learn out from that Mishnah about, a tree in consecrated land, its roots growing out to ordinary, or vice versa. We can't learn from that Mishnah what to do with the simple case of neighbors, where one neighbor's tree roots grow into the neighbor's land, and that guy starts digging and he cuts the roots off for his cistern, and the question is, who owns the wood of those roots? We can't learn it from a case involving the temple treasury, because that has its own unique considerations. So Ravina said, La Kasha, this is not difficult. Here in the first clause of the Mishnah in Tractate Me'ila, about misuse of consecrated property, it is referring to a case within 16 cubits of the tree. But in this case, the roots are considered part of the tree. But there in the second clause, it is referring to roots that have grown beyond 16 cubits, in which case the roots are considered part of the ground where they are found. The roots might be coming from that tree, but after you leave a circle with a radius of 16 cubits from the center, even though those roots came from the tree, now, legally speaking, they just become part of the ground. And if they're on a neighbor's property, forget it. There's no consideration at all of whether that wood belongs to the owner of the tree. Those roots, after they're 16 cubits, more than 16 cubits distance from the original tree, are automatically considered part of the ground. Now, Ula said, an individual who maintains a tree that is within 16 cubits of a boundary is a robber, as it draws nourishment from the neighbor's land, and one does not bring first fruits from it, bikkurim, since that would be a mitzvah that is fulfilled by means of a transgression, right? Mark Twain, I believe, said, stolen watermelon is sweeter, right? might be sweeter, but it doesn't belong to you. And if you are going to bring the first fruits offering to the Holy Temple during a pilgrimage festival when the temple was standing in Israel, you would not bring fruit to be the bikkurim offering if it was stolen. So that's obvious, right? You can never offer something that does not belong to you. But the Hiddush here, the newness of Ula's ruling, is that if your tree is less than 16 cubits away from your neighbor's property, then the fruit that grows from it has received at least part of its nourishment from your neighbor's land. And because it's being partially fed by something you didn't pay for, right? You didn't pay for the amount of nourishment that came from your neighbor's land. It's as if your fruits are growing from stolen nourishment, and therefore they don't qualify to be brought as bikkurim, as the first fruits offering. So the Gemara asks, from where does Ula derive that measurement? This idea that if it's within 16 cubits of the border, and that must be what we just said, that the roots, that are within 16 cubits of a tree's trunk, they are considered part of the tree, but roots further away than that are not. So that's why Ula said that it's only if your tree is less than 16 cubits away from your neighbor's land. From where does Ula derive that measurement? If we say it is from that which we learned in a Mishna in Tractate Shavi'it 1:6, well, this is problematic. That Mishnah teaches if there were 10 saplings scattered in a base sa, right? So a base sa is a field of a certain size. One may plow the entire base sa for their sake until Rosh Hashanah of the sabbatical year. Although it is prohibited to plow other land in the time leading into the sabbatical year to avoid the appearance of preparing to work the ground in that year, it is permitted to do so for the purpose of sustaining these young trees, right? So when the temple is standing and we're observing the Shemitah cycle, that every 7th year the land does not get worked, so the rule is, right, the law is you don't work the land during that whole 7th year. But even before that 7th year begins, there's some work that you would have done prior to that year, but it's for the purpose of the planting and seeding and harvesting of the 7th year. So you stop doing that work even before the 7th year arrives. But if that work is really so that saplings won't die, and it's not that you're doing it so that they'll be productive during the 7th year, but rather so they simply won't die, even though it might look like you're doing the kind of work that would be preparing for 7th year harvest, if in fact it's work that's simply to preserve the life of these saplings, it is permitted. So the Gemara calculates how much is the area of a base sa. In other words, it's a field that's large enough to produce this volume of grain, a sa of grain. So how much is the area of a base sa? It is 2,500 square cubits. And how much area is allocated for each and every one of the 10 trees? Well, that would be 1/10 of that, 250 square cubits. And this is not the distance that Ula taught. An area of 16 cubits to each side of the tree is a square of 32 by 32 cubits, or 1,000 square cubits, which is much larger than 250. So rather, Ula derived this measurement from that which we learned in the following Mishnah in Shavi'it 1:5. If there were 3 large trees belonging to 3 different people in one base sa, these trees combine, and one may plow the entire base sa for their sake. And how much is that area in cubits? It is 2,500 square cubits. And how much area is that for each of the trees? It is 833 1/3 square cubits. And this is still more than the amount that Ula established. And so the Gemara answers, Ula was not being precise in this matter. Now we're on page 27a. And the Gemara asks, well, one can say that we say that a sage was not precise in his measurements when his ruling leads to a stringency. But do we say that he was not precise if his measurement leads to a leniency? According to the previous explanation, Ula exempts the owner of a tree from bringing first fruits, even in a case where his tree does not in fact draw nourishment from his neighbor's field. And so the Gemara answers, do you maintain that we say the roots extend that far in a square? One measures 16 cubits to each side of a tree and creates a square of 32 cubits by 32 cubits? Why would you do that? We just said that the roots extend 16 cubits from the trunk of the tree. Well, that would be a circle with a radius of 16, not a square where each side is twice the 16. It really doesn't matter if your head is not like into math and geometry and surface area. Don't worry about it. This will become a little bit clearer in terms of what is the importance of what we're arguing, so just stay with it. So the Gemara asks, now, by how much is the area of a square greater than the area of a circle? I guess just so that we clarify what we're saying, it's like this. And forgive my terrible drawing, but imagine that that's a square, not a rectangle, with a circle in it, right? So this is a circle with a radius of 16, and that would also be, right, half of one side. So it's a square 32 by 32, or it's a circle with a radius of 16. And of course, the circle is smaller than the square, which encloses it. And now they're going to ask, by how much is it smaller? All right. So the Gemara asks, now, by how much is the area of a square greater than the area of a circle with a diameter which is the same length as the side of the square? It is greater by 1/4 of the area of the circle. 1/4? Is it really greater by 1/4? No, that's an approximation. And we've seen several times in our journey that when you're talking about the relationship between, right, the diameter of a circle and its area or its circumference, where you bring pi into it, which is 3.14159, etc. It's an irrational number, and the decimal just goes on infinitely. But it's about 3.1, and so very often they'll just use a ratio of 3 to 1, right? And so if we say that the square is about 1/4 larger than the circle, right, they're going to end up saying that it's about 3 to 1, and then there's an extra outside, and that's close enough, right? Right, it's great. It is the square is greater by 1/4 of the area of the circle. Well, if so, then 768 square cubits, which is 3/4 of the 1,024 square cubits that we discussed before for a square of 32 by 32, remain for each tree, but there still remains half a cubit more based on the Mishna's calculation. In other words, the measurement would be more accurate if a tree is considered to draw nourishment from a distance of 16.5 cubits on each side. And the Gemara answers, this is why we said that Ula was not precise, and he was not precise in a manner that leads to astringency, as one brings first fruits even from a tree that stands just 16 cubits from the boundary, rather than 16.5. Now the Gemara cites a proof against this opinion of Ula. Come and hear the following Mishna from tractate Bikkurim, right, about first fruits, 111. One who buys a tree and its land, brings first fruits, and recites the requisite Torah verses in Deuteronomy 26, verses 5 through 11, over them. Right? So when the temple is standing and you bring first fruits to Jerusalem, and then you recite, that the Lord brought us into the land, and he gave us this land, and I've raised these fruits, and now I haven't, eaten something that I wasn't supposed to eat, and I have brought what I was supposed to bring, and I stand innocent before God, and please accept this gift. More or less, that's very, very much paraphrased. So now, when we're doing that, and what is it? So what about a person? Now that's basically, you have to bring bikurim if you own the land, right? If you own the land that the trees are growing on. Well, what if somebody bought a tree and not the land? Right? Like I own, let's say, 10 apple trees on my property. I need some money. So I say to you, listen, I need some dough. You want to buy one of my apple trees. I'll sell it to you for $500. it's a great deal. Now you're going to own that apple tree and all the apples that come from it, for years. And it's going to be worth a lot more than $500. I'm selling it to you because I need the $500 now. So you don't own the land under it. What you bought was the tree. Now, what did you really buy? Did you buy the right to the apples from that tree? Or did you buy the tree? And in which case, if you bought the tree, do you own the land that the tree is on? Or do you simply own, the organic tree and a right, let's say, to take sustenance from the soil below it, but not the land that it's on? And if you didn't buy the land that it's on, are you obligated to bring bikkurim? That's what they're arguing about now. So says that Mishna in Tractate Bikkurim, one who buys a tree and its land brings first fruits and recites the requisite Torah verses over them. And what? Is it not referring to a case where one buys any amount of land with the tree? But if it's only the tree, then you don't bring the first fruits. Now the Gemara rejects this claim. No, it is referring to a case where one buys 16 cubits of land around the tree. And if you buy less than that, if you're only buying a little bit of land, let's say a circle, 3 cubits in diameter around the base of the tree, but you didn't buy the 16 cubit radius circle, which would include all the roots under the tree, then maybe you don't bring bikkurim because you're drawing all this sustenance from land that belongs to someone else, and then you don't trigger the bikkurim obligation. So the Gemara suggests, come in here an additional proof from another Mishnah in Tractate Bikkurim 1:6. If one bought 2 trees in the field of another, he brings first fruits, and he does not recite the verses because the land does not belong to him. So it may be inferred from here that if he bought 3 trees, he does bring first fruits and he does recite the verses. And what, is it not referring to a case where one buys any amount of land with the trees? So that now that there's 3 trees, there must be enough land coming with it that you can say that you own enough land and trees to trigger both the obligation to bring the fruits and to recite the verses that a landowner has to recite when he brings fruit from his trees? And the Gemara rejects this claim as well. No, here too, it is referring to a case where he acquires 16 cubits of land around the trees so that you can say that the trees he owns, the fruits he owns, and the fruits he owns because they drew sustenance from the land under his trees where the roots are found, and it's enough because he's got the 16 cubits around each tree trunk. And the Gemara suggests, come in here a proof from a Mishnah, Tractate Peah, where Rabbi Akiva says the owner of land of any size is obligated in Peah, right? So Peah is, imagine a wheat field, and when you harvest it, you leave the corners standing so that the poor can come and gather that. The owner of land of any size is obligated in Peah, leaving the corner unharvested so the poor can come. And he's also obligated in bikkurim, in first fruits. And a lender can write a document that prevents the sabbatical year from abrogating an outstanding debt, known as a prosbul for this land, so that loans he provided will not be canceled at the close of the sabbatical year. We've seen the prosbul before. Right, since all debts were canceled every 7 years, the poor had a very tough time obtaining a loan as the 7th year was approaching. So the sages instituted the legal mechanism of a prosbul, where a lender would lend money to a borrower, but then he would transfer that loan to the court. The court, therefore, the borrower would officially owe the money to the court, and then the court, would flow through and give the money to the lender. But in order to establish the prosbul, a requirement of that is that there is a piece of land that is owed, right? And the lender has to own some land in order to make this mechanism work. We don't have to go into the technicalities of that, but he has to own some land. How much land does he have to own? Even a little bit is fine. But even if you own even a little bit of land in Israel, you are obligated in bikkurim if there's fruits growing on that land, in peah if there's grain growing on that land, you leave it there, and you're able to write a prosbul. Now we're on page 27b. And somebody who has even this small piece of land, he can acquire property that does not serve as a guarantee, meaning movable property, along with it. That when you buy your piece of land, if there's movable property on it, the fact that you acquired the land can act as a kinyan, a formal act of acquisition for the movable property that was located on that piece of real property, on that land. So there are specific modes of acquisition for movable property, but if one is acquiring any amount of land at the same time as the movable property, the mode of acquisition employed to acquire the land suffices for the acquisition of the movable property as well. So apparently, any amount of land is subject to first fruits, whereas according to Ula, a tree acquired with less than 16 cubits of land surrounding it draws nourishment from the land surrounding it and would be exempt from bringing the bikkurim, the first fruits offering. Now the Gemara rejects this idea. With what are we dealing here? We are dealing with wheat, which is subject to the laws of first fruits and requires very little land to nourish it. So the Gemara comments that the language of the Mishnah is also precise, as it teaches land of any size, which indicates even a minuscule amount, and all normal trees certainly require more land than that, and the Gemara affirms, learn from it that it is so. Now the Gemara further suggests, come in here a proof from a Baraisa in Tosefta of Masrot 222, if there is a tree, part of which is in the land of Israel and part of which is outside the land of Israel, it is considered as though untithed produce, i.e. produce that is subject to the laws of terumot and tithes, and non-sacred produce, i.e. produce that is exempt from the laws of terumot and tithes, are mixed together in each one of this tree's fruits. This is the statement of Rebbe, right? So this idea that there are obligations of how you have to tithe and when you have to tithe and how you allocate the tithe based on whether your tree is growing in the land of Israel or not. So this tree that is on the border and is drawing nourishment both from the land of Israel and from land outside the land of Israel ends up mixing, the requirements for each of the fruit on that tree. And the Gemara comments, so Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, with regard to the fruits in the part of the tree that is growing in a place where there is an obligation to separate tithes, meaning the land of Israel, the owner is obligated to separate tithes. With regard to the fruits that are growing in a place where there is an exemption from separating tithes, meaning land outside the land of Israel, the owner is exempt. So what do you do with fruits that are growing on a tree on the border? So the Gemara comments, they disagree only in that one sage, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, holds that there is retroactive designation. And therefore, it is assumed that the nourishment drawn from the land of Israel sustained the fruit that grew on that side of the tree, and the nourishment drawn from outside of Eretz Yisrael sustained the fruit that grew on that side of the tree. And one sage, Rebbe, holds that there is no retroactive designation and the fruit is considered mixed. But if the tree grew entirely in a place where there is an exemption from tithing, meaning it grew outside of Israel, all agree that its owner is exempt from tithing, bringing first fruits, etc. Even though the tree might have roots within 16 cubits of Israel and draw nourishment from there. It's not that the tree is on the border, the tree is outside Israel, but its roots extend into Israel. So here it seems to be saying that even if the roots extend into Israel, the owner of the tree whose tree is, the trunk is outside of Israel, he's going to be exempt from bikkurim and tithes. So this presents a difficulty for the opinion of Ula, as he claims that the place from where a tree draws its nourishment, right, from where the roots draw nourishment, is decisive with regard to whether you're obligated in bikkurim or not. So the Gemara answers, with what are we dealing here? We are dealing with a case where a rock divides the roots up to the trunk. And therefore it is possible to distinguish between the parts of the tree that draw nutrients from Eretz Yisrael and the parts that draw nutrients from outside the land of Israel. It's like a tree on the border, but there's a clear division of its roots. These roots go out to outside of Israel, and these roots go into Israel, and they go up. Now, they're still going to mix in the trunk, but more or less, you could say that, okay, but this side of the tree is all from roots in Israel, and that side of the tree, all its fruits are from roots outside of Israel. Very strange case, but certainly for the purposes of arguing the law, one we should consider. So then what? So if so, what is the reasoning of Rebbe? Why does he view the fruits as being a mixture? And the Gemara answers, he holds that although there is a division between the roots, they cannot be distinguished from one another as they become mixed up in the body of the tree, in the trunk. So the Gemara asks, and with regard to what principle do they disagree? What's really at stake here? And the Gemara answers that one sage, Rebbe, holds that the air above the ground mixes the nutrients, and the other sage, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, holds this part of the tree stands alone and that part of the tree stands alone. From the roots up to the branches, it is as if the tree were cut along the line of the border, right? That everything goes straight up the trunk, and so if all the roots are on one side of the border, then that half of the tree is considered to, all the fruits on that half of the tree are getting their sustenance from where the roots are, and the same for the other side, says Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, whereas Rebbe says it all gets mixed up in the trunk of the tree. Now, the Gemara raises a difficulty against Ula's opinion from a different perspective. And do roots extend 16 cubits and no more? Didn't we learn in the Mishna on page 25b that one must distance a tree 25 cubits from a cistern? This indicates that tree roots reach more than 16 cubits. And Abaye said, the roots extend farther, but they weaken the ground only up to 16 cubits. With regard to an area more distant than that, they don't weaken the ground, and so while we shouldn't allow them to get that close to a cistern because they'll create leaks in the cistern, we also don't say that part of the roots goes with the tree. We can say that part of the roots goes with the soil. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. Now, concerning this matter, the Gemara relates that when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael, he said, Reish Lakish raised a dilemma before Rabbi Yochanan with regard to a tree that is within 16 cubits of a boundary. What is the law? Rabbi Yochanan said to him, the owner is a robber, and one does not bring first fruits from it. By contrast, when Ravin came from Eretz Yisrael, he related that Rabbi Yochanan says, both in the case of a tree that is close to a boundary and a tree that leans into a neighbor's yard, one brings first fruits and recites the verses, as it was on this condition that Joshua apportioned the land of Israel to the Jewish people, i.e. that they would not be particular about such matters. We've seen that ruling a bunch of other times, that when Joshua sort of led the Jewish people in, there was this sense that we're going to apportion different parts of Israel, different regions to the different tribes, and then within the regions, pieces of land will be given to every family. These are the ancestral holdings. But, we're all one people, and there's going to be public areas, and there's going to be this idea that we're not going to be too particular about your land versus my land because we're all participating in the joint project of settling the land of Israel for the Jewish people. And therefore, because of that kind of joint team effort, as it were, even though my tree on my land its roots might be drawing sustenance from your land, that's sort of within the scope of this idea that we all settle the land together. And so the trees that are actually on my property, irrespective of where the roots are, I'm going to bring those fruits, and I'm not going to say, well, I would be a robber of this nourishment from my neighbor's field, so these fruits aren't really mine. No, we don't say that. We say they are mine, and therefore I'm obligated to bring a portion of my first fruits as offerings when the temple is standing in Jerusalem. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 12. And we'll pick it up tomorrow, God willing, at the regular Monday time, 6 p.m. Pacific, with Mishnah number 13 here on page 27b. Okay. Let's see. Joe. I have a standard size grapefruit tree in my backyard that my grandfather started from a seed. That's awesome. Now, let's just say that there is great sentimental value to me in this tree. So I am sure that its roots have spread into all of the adjoining backyards. The new neighbors behind me dug up their ground and poured concrete for a large shed. My tree went into shock, but with lots of water and care, it has been saved. My neighbors next to me counseled me to go over and complain, which I refused to do because I believe that they have the absolute right to use their land as they see fit. So beautiful illustration of exactly the principles that we're talking about here. We see, first of all, that since your tree was affected when they dug down deep and cut off your roots for something they needed to do on their property, which is like a cistern because they put deep concrete foundations, and it affected your tree. So clearly your tree, its roots were over there. Thank God that the tree came out of shock with the loving care that you provided for it. And it sounds, in terms of did the neighbors do anything wrong, I agree with you, probably not. Should they have limited, should they have observed a setback, or did they go right up to the property line? I mean, first of all, we don't live in a country that is observing Torah law as the sovereign law, right? So, whatever the laws of your jurisdiction are going to be operative. And we can't say we're going to impose Torah law on our neighbors. But I'm just so happy to hear that the tree came out of shock. We have a loquat tree here that I would say the same thing. It went into shock, and a large part, like half remained okay, half really bad shape, and unclear if those, there are branches within the tree that are no longer producing leaves or fruit, seem really dry. But I hope that I haven't heard this term before, that a tree goes into shock. So I'm hoping that that's what happened, and eventually they'll come back. Now, Sharon, slightly different, but our next door neighbors sold their home, and the new owners put in a pond by bringing in multiple truckloads of dirt, and then put in a large pond with a runoff pipe into the small brook between our properties. When we built our home, it was not there, and we landscaped for the possibility of a 500-year flood as required. Now, however, we have surface water problems that we never had before the neighbor's pond. So these folks then sold the property again. It was their property, but severely impacted us. Is that okay? I mean, it sounds like by Torah law, no, because it really impacted you. I mean, this sounds like a case of arrows, right? Where, without even getting to the issue of setback, it's clear that the work they did on their land is having direct impact on you. I don't know, what the zoning ordinances and the laws of your jurisdiction would say, but it seems like according to Torah law, you would have a good argument, and just because of direct damage and arrows, and then we would get into the discussion of the setback and how far, etc. But it seems like a good argument. Now, Tom, what if the tree is entirely outside Israel, but some of the fruit falls onto the land? So that's where they were talking about the tree leaning in. There they were talking about neighbors, but it's a really interesting question. The tree is outside of Israel. The roots are outside of Israel, but the branches extend into Israel, and the fruit falls within Israel. Definitely an interesting question. I don't know. Ilani, what is the obligation of these concerns about neighboring trees if a Jew's tree roots goes into a non-Jew's land? Is the tree a thief for those nutrients regarding bikkurim, or is it of no concern? I mean, your question shows you have a perfect understanding of the issues. And I just don't know how this works. For sure, we are obligated not to steal, right? Stealing from a Jew, stealing from a non-Jew, prohibited in both cases in the same way. But that's not really what we're talking about. What we're talking about is if the temple is standing, and we're drawing sustenance from the neighbor's yard, then according to some opinions, the tree is considered like because its nourishment was stolen, that we would say that the fruit is either not obligated in bikkurim or it is obligated in bikkurim, but one doesn't recite the verses. But then we see the other opinion of Rabbi Yochanan that says, well, this is how the land was settled. So I think even if it's a non-Jew, who's your neighbor, but within the land of Israel, it probably won't matter. And you would bring the fruit and you would recite the verses. But that's my opinion off the top of my head. And I am definitely not a poskening rabbi, so I'm not sure. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Monday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.